For more than a century, Jack the Ripper has remained one of history's most infamous unanswered questions. In the autumn of 1888, London's Whitechapel district became the scene of a series of brutal murders, and the killer disappeared before investigators could put a name to him. 5 victims are traditionally regarded as the canonical 5: Marion Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Their murders occurred between August and November 1888, and the similarities between the crimes led police and newspapers to connect them to the same unknown killer. The mystery has survived because the evidence is frustratingly incomplete. There was no modern crime scene photography, no fingerprint database, no CCTV, and certainly no forensic DNA testing. Investigators worked with witness statements, physical descriptions, footprints, letters, clothing, and whatever fragments of evidence happened to survive. More than a century later, dozens of men have been proposed as the killer, but none has been universally accepted. And then came DNA. For a moment, it looked as though the oldest mystery in criminal history might finally have a scientific answer. A stained silk shawl, allegedly associated with Catherine Eddowes, was examined by researchers using mitochondrial DNA analysis. The results appeared to point toward one of the most frequently discussed suspects in the entire case: Aaron Kosminski. But there is a problem. The DNA did not conclusively prove that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. And understanding why requires going much deeper than the headlines. The story begins with the shawl itself. According to the accounts surrounding the object, it was supposedly recovered after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, who was killed in Mitre Square on September 30th, 1888. The shawl eventually came into the possession of a family in Essex, who maintained that an ancestor connected to the police had taken it from the crime scene. The object was later purchased by author Russell Edwards, who believed it could contain biological material left by the killer. That is where modern DNA analysis entered the story. Researchers Jari Luhalainen and David Miller published a forensic study examining biological stains on the shawl. Their paper reported mitochondrial DNA profiles associated with both the victim and a suspected killer, and the researchers argued that the findings strengthened the connection between the shawl and the murder. The suspect they connected to the evidence was Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish-born Jewish barber who lived in London during the period of the murders. He had been identified in historical Ripper literature as a suspect, and surviving police documentation shows that investigators did consider him. But the historical record does not contain a confession, a conviction, or definitive physical evidence establishing that Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. That distinction matters enormously, because when the DNA study became public, headlines transformed a complicated genetic result into something much more absolute. Jack the Ripper had finally been identified. But science does not work by headline. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is inherited through the maternal line. Unlike a full nuclear DNA profile, it is not generally capable of uniquely identifying one individual. Large numbers of unrelated people can share the same mitochondrial lineage. That means a mitochondrial match can potentially support a connection, but by itself it does not function like the unique DNA fingerprint many people imagine. Experts raised precisely this concern after the study was published. There was another problem. The shawl's history is uncertain. For forensic evidence to be powerful, investigators need to establish where an object came from, who handled it, and whether it could have been contaminated before testing. In the case of this shawl, its documented chain of custody does not begin in 1888 with a police evidence locker. Instead, the story depends heavily on a later family account claiming that the object originated at the Eddowes crime scene. Critics have therefore questioned whether the shawl can actually be demonstrated to have been present at the murder. That means we have 2 separate questions. First, does the DNA on the shawl match genetic material associated with Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski? Second, can we prove that the shawl was actually at the crime scene in 1888 and that the biological material came from the people the researchers claimed? Those are not the same question. And in a murder investigation, that difference can determine whether evidence is decisive or merely intriguing. The controversy became even more serious in 2024. The Journal of Forensic Sciences issued an expression of concern regarding the published Shawl study. The journal explained that third parties had raised concerns about the conclusions drawn from the mitochondrial DNA analysis. It also stated that the publisher had attempted to obtain the original raw data from the researchers, but the authors reported that the data were no longer available because of instrument data failure and other complications. Because the original data could not be examined, the journal said the concerns could not be resolved. That does not automatically mean the original researchers were wrong, but it does mean the scientific claim cannot responsibly be presented as a settled identification. And this is where the real mystery becomes even more fascinating. Because Aaron Kosminski was not simply a random name pulled from a database. He was already considered a suspect in historical accounts of the investigation. Police interest in Kosminski is one reason the DNA story initially sounded so convincing. If an unknown DNA sample had pointed toward a man nobody had ever heard of, the discovery would have been extraordinary. But in this case, the DNA story appeared to reinforce an existing suspect. The temptation was obvious. Perhaps modern science had finally confirmed what detectives in 1888 had already suspected. But historical suspicion is not proof. The surviving records are complicated, and the identity of the killer was never established in court. Even the precise number of murders committed by Jack the Ripper remains uncertain. The Metropolitan Police investigation covered a broader group of Whitechapel murders, while the 5 canonical victims became the group most commonly associated with the Ripper. And there is another fascinating detail. The DNA evidence people often discuss is not a complete genetic portrait of Jack the Ripper. It is not a pristine blood sample preserved from the killer. It is not a modern forensic database hit. It is not a complete nuclear DNA profile with millions of genetic markers that can be compared against a living descendant. Instead, the case revolves around biological traces allegedly recovered from an old textile whose connection to the crime itself is disputed. That makes the phrase DNA confirms Jack the Ripper dramatically stronger than the underlying evidence warrants. Still, the investigation raises a question that has fascinated forensic scientists for years. Could technology eventually solve a crime that happened before forensic genetics even existed? In principle, yes. Ancient and historical DNA technology has advanced enormously. Scientists can now recover genetic information from biological material that would once have been considered useless. Modern sequencing can sometimes separate genuine genetic signals from contamination and degradation. But the older the evidence, the more difficult the problem becomes. DNA breaks down, samples can be contaminated, and historical objects may have passed through dozens or hundreds of hands before reaching a laboratory. The Ripper case is almost the perfect example of that challenge. Imagine discovering a cigarette but at a modern murder scene. Investigators could potentially extract DNA, compare it with databases, establish the object's location through surveillance footage, and build a chain of custody. Now remove all of that. Replace the cigarette with a piece of fabric that has allegedly survived since 1888. Remove the police documentation proving where it came from. Remove the original crime scene photographs. Remove modern DNA reference databases. Then ask science to identify a murderer who died more than a century ago. Suddenly, the problem looks very different. And yet, the Shawl remains important because it demonstrates something genuinely remarkable. Biological material can survive for generations under the right conditions, and modern forensic techniques can extract information from extremely old evidence. The 2019 study described sophisticated methods for recovering cells and analyzing mitochondrial DNA, and the researchers also reported phenotypic information from DNA recovered from the material. But even the researchers themselves did not possess the one thing that would make the case overwhelmingly persuasive: an uncontested, properly documented crime scene sample containing a unique genetic profile that could be independently matched to Kosminski. Without that, the mystery survives. And perhaps the most important lesson from the entire story is that DNA does not magically transform uncertain history into certainty. DNA is evidence. Its value depends on context. If you know where a sample came from, who handled it, how it was preserved, and what genetic markers were recovered, you can build an extremely powerful case. If you don't know those things, a genetic match can become much less decisive. That is exactly why independent experts criticized the Shawl study. Concerns were raised about contamination, provenance, interpretation of mitochondrial DNA, and the inability to independently examine the original raw data. There was even a particularly important scientific criticism concerning the mitochondrial DNA attributed to Kosminski. Critics argued that the reported genetic evidence did not provide the kind of unique identification that the public was led to believe. Some analyses pointed to limitations in the reported sequence comparison itself. So where does that leave Aaron Kosminski? As a suspect. Perhaps an important suspect, but not a scientifically proven Jack the Ripper. And that distinction becomes even more significant when we remember what happened to the other major theories. Over the decades, writers have accused doctors, aristocrats, artists, criminals, immigrants, surgeons, and ordinary working men. Some theories have been built around handwriting, others around geography, others around psychological profiles. Some depend on alleged letters sent by the killer, while others rely on interpreting police notes written decades after the murders. The result is a maze of possibilities. Kosminski simply happens to have something many of the others lack, a proposed physical connection through DNA. But a proposed connection is not the same thing as identification. And there is an uncomfortable possibility that the mystery may never be solved. Not because Jack the Ripper was supernatural. Not because the evidence was deliberately destroyed by some secret organization. But because the passage of 137 years may simply have erased too much information. The investigators of 1888 were working at the beginning of modern forensic science. They could not preserve evidence with the standards we expect today. They could not anticipate DNA testing. They did not know that future scientists might desperately want to examine the biological traces they left behind. And every year that passed gave the evidence more opportunities to disappear. People died. Objects were discarded. Records were lost. Memories changed. Stories were embellished. And eventually, fact and legend became almost impossible to separate. That is why the most honest conclusion today is also the least satisfying. The DNA evidence surrounding the famous Shawl does not conclusively reveal Jack the Ripper's identity. It points toward Aaron Kosminski as part of a controversial hypothesis. But the evidence has serious limitations, and the scientific publication itself now carries an expression of concern because questions about its data and conclusions remain unresolved. So the title of this story contains a twist. The new DNA evidence did not finally close the case. Instead, it reopened a much older question. How much evidence do we need before we are willing to say that history has been solved? Because there is a huge difference between saying this man may have been Jack the Ripper and saying DNA proves this man was Jack the Ripper. The first is a hypothesis. The second requires extraordinary evidence. And after more than a century, that evidence has still not appeared. Maybe someday researchers will find another preserved object. Maybe new sequencing technology will recover a full nuclear DNA profile from surviving biological material. Maybe historians will discover a forgotten police record that changes the entire investigation. Or maybe the killer's identity is already lost forever. Perhaps the most chilling part is that the man known as Jack the Ripper may have walked through the streets of Victorian London for years after the murders without ever being publicly identified. He could have been one of the suspects police questioned. He could have been someone investigators never noticed. He could even have been a person whose name has disappeared completely from the surviving records. We simply do not know. What we do know is that 5 women were murdered in Whitechapel in 1888, that their deaths created one of the most enduring criminal mysteries in history, and that modern science has not yet transformed that mystery into a proven identity. And perhaps that's why the story of Jack the Ripper refuses to die. Every generation believes it might be the generation that finally solved the case. In 1888, detectives searched the streets. In the 20th century, historians searched the archives. In the 21st century, Scientists are searching the molecules left behind, and somewhere between those three worlds may be the truth. But for now, Aaron Kosminski remains a suspect, not a confirmed killer. The Shawl remains controversial. The DNA remains disputed. And Jack the Ripper remains officially unidentified. After 137 years, the mystery is still alive. And that may be the strangest revelation of all.